The first thing I lost wasn't my money. It was the way my family looked at me. I remember the exact moment it changed, how their voices softened with pity instead of warmth, how my name suddenly carried a sigh after it, like I was already a disappointment before I even spoke. I didn't know then that this was the beginning of everything falling apart. I only knew that I felt smaller in rooms where I used to feel safe. I was 24 when my life unraveled, not dramatically, not with a single explosion. It happened quietly through missed calls, delayed replies, and conversations that ended too fast. I had always believed that family meant permanence, that even when things went wrong, love would stay steady underneath it all. I trusted that belief with the innocence of someone who had never been abandoned before. I worked hard. I always had. I took a job that didn't pay much but promised growth, and when the company collapsed, I told myself it was temporary. I'll figure it out, I kept saying, and at first my family nodded. They said things like, "You'll bounce back, and this is just a phase." I held onto those words like a lifeline, but phases make people impatient. As weeks passed, the questions changed. Why haven't you found something yet? Are you even trying? Maybe you aimed too high. I noticed how my mother stopped asking how I felt and started asking when I'd be back on my feet. My father listened less and calculated more. Even my siblings, who used to laugh with me late into the night, began to speak carefully around me, like my situation was contagious. Still, I trusted them. I shared everything, my fears, my plans, my hope that something would open up soon. I didn't realize that vulnerability was slowly being recorded, stored, and later used as evidence against me. The day I lost everything came without warning: a failed interview, a drained savings account, a landlord who needed rent I didn't have. I went to my parents' house that evening, not to ask for money, but for reassurance. I wanted to sit at the kitchen table, drink tea, and feel like someone believed in me. Instead, I walked into judgment. My father barely looked up from his phone. My mother sighed before I even spoke. And my sister, who had always been effortlessly successful, leaned back with crossed arms, watching me like a problem that needed solving. "This can't go on," my mother said. I nodded, already agreeing. "You're becoming dependent." My father added. My chest tightened. "We've helped enough." My sister said calmly. Help, that word echoed in my head. Help implied generosity, but what they had offered lately felt more like tolerance. I tried to explain that I wasn't lazy, that I was applying everywhere, that I just needed time. My voice shook, not because I was weak, but because I still believed they would understand if I said the right words. They didn't. "You need to face reality." My father said, "We can't carry you." My mother added, and honestly, my sister said, "You're starting to feel like a burden, a burden." The word landed softly but cut deep. No yelling, no cruelty, just a simple conclusion they had all quietly agreed on. I looked at their faces, familiar, calm, resolved, and realized something terrifying. They had already let go of me emotionally. I was the last one to notice. That night, I went back to my small apartment and sat on the floor because I had already sold my couch. I didn't cry right away. I just stared at the wall and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering how love could evaporate so cleanly. Over the next few days, the distance grew. Calls stopped. Messages became short. When I did hear from them, it was advice wrapped in impatience. Suggestions that felt like reminders of my failure. I wasn't angry. I was confused. I kept thinking, if this is what happens when I fault, what was all that love before? I didn't know it yet, but that question would change the way I understood family forever. And it would be the last day I waited for anyone to save me. Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in quietly until you suddenly realize no one is listening anymore. After that night at my parents' house, I stopped reaching out as often. Not because I was proud, but because every conversation left me feeling smaller than before. I told myself they were busy. I told myself they needed time. I kept making excuses for them because it was easier than admitting the truth, that my worth to them had always been tied to my usefulness. Days passed, then weeks. My phone stayed still, no good morning messages, no casual check-ins. When I finally called my mother, she answered with surprise in her voice, like I had interrupted something more important. "Is everything okay?" she asked, but she didn't wait for the answer. I told her I was managing. I always said that. Managing sounded better than struggling. It sounded responsible, controlled, acceptable. She reminded me to stay positive and suggested a few jobs I had already applied for. Then she said she had to go. The call lasted 3 minutes. That was when I understood that I wasn't being rejected loudly. I was being slowly erased. I stopped being invited to family dinners. Group chats went quiet when I joined them. My sister once sent a message meant for someone else complaining about how exhausting it was to carry people who won't help themselves. She deleted it quickly. She never apologized. I never replied. What hurt the most wasn't what they said. It was what they stopped saying. No one asked how I was sleeping. No one asked if I had eaten. No one asked if I was scared. I moved through my days like a ghost, showing up to interviews with a practiced smile, returning home to an apartment that echoed with uncertainty. Money ran out. I sold more things, books I loved, clothes I had worn on happier days. Each item felt like proof that I was failing in slow motion. Still, I didn't ask for help. I had already learned the cost of that. One afternoon, I ran into my aunt at the grocery store. She smiled politely, then hesitated, as if deciding whether to speak. "I heard you're having a hard time," she said. I nodded. "You know," she continued gently, "your parents are worried. They just don't know what to do with you anymore. I thanked her and walked away, my hand shaking around the grocery basket. That sentence followed me home. It explained everything. I wasn't a daughter in trouble. I was a problem without a solution. That night, I sat in the dark and replayed every memory I had of my family's love. The holidays, the laughter, the pride in their voices when I succeeded. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Their affection had always grown louder when I was doing well, and quieter when I wasn't. I wondered how I had missed it. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired, deeply tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying hope that keeps getting dropped. So I stopped trying to prove myself. I stopped updating them, stopped explaining, stopped hoping they would suddenly remember how to care. I focused on surviving quietly, carefully, without witnesses. I found a temporary job that barely paid the bills but gave me structure. I learned how to stretch meals. I learned how to sit with discomfort without calling anyone to soften it. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The silence that once hurt me began to teach me. In the absence of their voices, I started hearing my own. I noticed how much energy I had spent trying to be acceptable, how often I apologized for existing, how quickly I had believed their disappointment was the truth about me. I began to understand that being abandoned doesn't always look like doors slamming. Sometimes it looks like people stepping back and waiting to see if you disappear on your own. One evening, I realized it had been months since anyone in my family had said my name with affection. They talked about me, I was sure, but not to me. I had become a story they told each other, a cautionary tale, a quiet embarrassment. And yet I was still here, still breathing, still trying, still learning how to stand without leaning on love that came with conditions. That was the moment I stopped waiting for the silence to end. I didn't know yet where I was going or how I would rebuild my life. But for the first time, I understood something clearly. If I was going to be saved, it would have to be by me. And strangely, that thought didn't scare me anymore. There is a quiet kind of pain that comes after heartbreak, not sharp enough to cry over, not loud enough for anyone else to notice. It settles into your routine and waits. That was the season I entered after I stopped expecting my family to return. At first, I didn't feel strong. I felt empty, like a house after guests leave and the noise fades, leaving behind the mess you didn't see while everyone was talking. I woke up early, worked long hours at my temporary job, came home exhausted, and repeated it all the next day. Survival became my only goal, not healing, not growth, just getting through, but something subtle began to change. Without constant judgment, my thoughts slowed down. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped rewriting answers I wished I had given. There was no one to impress anymore, no one to convince. For the first time in my life, my days belonged entirely to me. I started small. I made my bed every morning not because anyone would see it, but because it reminded me that I could still care for something. I cooked simple meals and ate them at the table instead of standing over the sink. I went for evening walks, letting the quiet streets remind me that the world didn't end just because my family turned away. Some nights were harder than others. I would hear laughter from a nearby apartment or see families walking together, and grief would rise unexpectedly. Not for the people who had hurt me, but for the version of myself who believed love was unconditional. I let that version of me rest. As weeks passed, I noticed I was apologizing less. I no longer felt the need to explain why my life hadn't followed a neat timeline. When coworkers asked about my family, I answered honestly but briefly. I didn't dress up the truth, and I didn't tear it down either. I was learning balance. One afternoon, my mother sent a message. Just one line, "How are things?" I stared at it for a long time. The old me would have poured my heart into a response, hoping this was an opening. The new me paused. I asked myself a simple question. What do I need right now? The answer wasn't her reassurance. It wasn't approval. It was peace, so I replied, "I'm okay. I hope you are too. Nothing more, nothing less." She didn't respond. And for the first time, that didn't break me. I began to see patterns I had once ignored. How love in my family was often transactional. How success earned praise, while struggle earned distance. How I had been gentle not just by nature, but by necessity, because staying soft kept the peace. Letting go of that role felt like shedding a heavy coat I didn't realize I was wearing. I found a better job. Not perfect, not glamorous, but stable. I moved to a smaller place closer to work. On the day I signed the lease, I sat alone on the floor of my new living room and cried not from sadness, but from relief. I had done this quietly, without applause. With stability came clarity. I no longer wanted to return to the version of family that only welcomed me when I was useful. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting distance out of spite. I was simply choosing honesty, and honesty meant admitting that being close to them had cost me more than it gave. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, stopped imagining future conversations where everything would finally make sense. Some people don't reflect, they revise history instead. Time passed, seasons changed, and with them I changed too. I became calmer, more observant, less reactive. I learned that strength doesn't announce itself, it shows up consistently. It pays bills, it keeps promises to itself, it rests without guilt. One evening, as I sat by my window watching the city lights come on, I realized something important. I no longer felt like a failure trying to recover. I felt like a woman who had been tested and survived with her dignity intact. That was when I understood the truth I had been circling for months. Walking away hadn't made me lonely. It had made me free. And I was finally ready for whatever came next, even if it arrived quietly, with no warning at all. The knock came on an ordinary evening. I had just finished washing the last plate, the apartment warm with the quiet comfort I had built piece by piece. Outside, the city hummed softly, like it always did, indifferent, steady, alive. I wasn't expecting anyone. I rarely was. When the sound came again, gentle and unsure, my first thought wasn't fear. It was curiosity. I opened the door slowly. My mother stood there, holding her purse with both hands like an anchor. Behind her, my father waited, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes older than I remembered. They looked smaller somehow, as if time had pressed them down while I was learning how to stand taller. For a moment, none of us spoke. "I hope this is okay," my mother said finally. Her voice carried none of the authority it once had. We were nearby. I nodded and stepped aside, not out of obligation, but because I was calm enough to choose. They sat at my small table, taking in the room, the clean counters, the neatly folded blanket on the chair, the quiet order. I watched them notice things without commenting. The silence felt different now. It no longer asked me to fill it. "You look well," my father said carefully. "I am," I replied. It wasn't a defense, it was a fact. My mother's eyes softened, then clouded. "We didn't realize how much you were struggling," she said. "We thought giving you space would help." I met her gaze. I had practiced this moment many times in my mind, but standing there, I felt no urge to correct her version of events. I had learned that understanding doesn't always come from agreement. Space can be helpful. I said, "But silence sends its own message." She nodded slowly, as if hearing that for the first time. They didn't apologize, not fully. There were pauses where apologies could have lived, but didn't. Instead, there were explanations softened by time. I listened without interrupting, without shrinking, without offering reassurance they hadn't earned. I noticed something then. I wasn't desperate for their recognition anymore. I wasn't waiting for them to name my pain correctly. I already had. "We've missed you," my father said quietly. I believed him, and still, belief didn't erase the past. I needed to learn who I was without disappointment following me. I said, I needed to build a life where I wasn't afraid of falling. They exchanged a look, one I had seen before, usually when deciding something without me. This time, it felt different, less certain. "We don't expect anything," my mother said. "We just wanted to see you." I appreciated that. Truly, but appreciation doesn't always mean access. When they left, they hugged me carefully, like people relearning how close they're allowed to stand. I watched them walk down the hallway until they disappeared, then closed the door gently behind them. I didn't cry. I sat on the couch and let the quiet settle. My heart felt steady, not hardened, just whole. I thought about the woman I had been when everything fell apart, how she begged silently for love to stay, how she believed survival meant proving her worth. She had done her best, but she was no longer me. I understood now that emotional justice isn't loud. It doesn't require confrontation or victory speeches. Sometimes it looks like peace arriving before regret does. Sometimes it's being able to open the door without losing yourself inside the room. I didn't cut my family out completely. I didn't welcome them back without boundaries either. I chose something gentler, something truer. Distance with dignity, contact without surrender. That night I went to bed knowing something had ended, and something else had begun. I had learned that love offered only in success is not love at all, that boundaries are not punishments but protections, and that walking away can sometimes be the most respectful conversation you'll ever have. The knock didn't change my life. It simply confirmed that I already had.